We have with us CNA's Olivia Seong, Michio Ishida in Japan, and Lim Yoon-suk in Seoul. Thanks so very much for joining us. Well, let's just start off with you first, Yoon-suk. President Yoon, he's held these bilateral talks on a whole range of issues with Premier Lee as well as Prime Minister Kishida. What do you think was the most constructive outcome from those discussions?
Well, yes, he held the bilateral meetings with Japan and China. And, many analysts here were saying that, he probably got more done during the bilateral meetings than the trilateral discussions, and especially with China, because during the bilateral meeting with China, the two leaders discussed North Korea's threats, and also President Yoon was able to urge China to play a more constructive role in containing North Korea's growing missile and nuclear threats. Now, he also voiced concerns about this close cooperation between North Korea and Russia. Now, the two sides then, during the bilateral meeting, also agreed on setting up this high-level diplomatic and security dialogue, with the first round of talks scheduled to take place next month. Now, the dialogue is seen as significant here because it will be held by high-level officials from both the foreign and defense ministries, and many analysts here are saying that they will be able to definitely talk in depth about the security issues and also North Korea. And even when, President Yoon held bilateral meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, they were able to talk about sensitive issues like the recent dispute over this messaging apps by South Korea's neighbor and Japan's SoftBank. And so analysts are saying that the bilateral meetings allowed all parties to discuss a wide range of issues, and they believe that there should be more of the bilateral meetings between the three leaders.
Olivia, let's bring you in here. Well, the discussions seem optimistic, hopeful with the joint statements that they've released. It seems pretty significant that the Chinese premier, turned up in Seoul. And he also talked about a new beginning for trilateral cooperation. So what should we read into this?
Yeah, I was just looking at the readout from China after this meeting. You will notice the language that has been used. Here we see Premier Lee talk about how the three countries are at a new starting point, talking about re-galvanizing and accelerating cooperation, embarking on a new journey. It's a rather conciliatory tone that we are seeing from China, which observers say is significant given the previous tensions that we have seen it have with South Korea and Japan. On the geopolitical front, observers say this charm offensive seen from China is widely believed to be a response to another trilateral summit that happened at Camp David in the U.S. last year, that amid the prism of the ongoing China-U.S. rivalry as China views U.S. actions as trying to contain its development. And in terms of cooperation, we saw the Chinese premier talk about a deepening economic and trade connectivity, stressing the need to keep industrial and supply chains stable and unimpeded. Now, reading between the lines of that, we know that China would have on its mind U.S. calls to get its partners like South Korea and Japan to further tighten restrictions on exports of semiconductor technology to China. And so the Chinese premier perhaps wanting to convince South Korea and Japan to not go that far, as that would have an impact on its economy, which it clearly has an eye on. We know that China has continued to try to woo foreign investment back into China as its economy still faces many challenges, including in its property sector. And we also saw, for example, Premier Lee meet the head of Samsung, talking about welcoming the South Korean company's investment into China. Also, as China would be wary of the global climate, we saw those additional tariffs that the U.S. has imposed on Chinese electric vehicles, possibly with the European Union set to do the same. And so South Korea and Japan would be important markets for China, especially in this region.
And Mitchell, let's hear from Japan's perspective. I mean, the charm offensive. I mean, to what extent? Because the Prime Minister Kishida, he met with Premier Lee, and I believe they talked about the Chinese ban of Japanese seafood imports, as well as Taiwan. Those are big topics of discussion. So what came out of that?
Okay, well, to give you a little bit of background, China banned Japanese marine products completely due to the release of treated radioactive water from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, which experienced the meltdown in the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. Now, contaminated water in the plant from cooling fuel rod and from rainwater that has accumulated has been processed to remove radionuclides except for tritium, and tritium is diluted before the release of the water. Now, the International Atomic Energy Agency has assessed its safety with Chinese scientists, and Environment Ministry monitors and releases updates on the radiation level in and around the Fukushima waters. Marine products are screened, and Mr. Kishida explained to Premier Lee the safety measures taken and sought for Beijing to lift import ban. But we are hearing that Mr. Lee did not consent and continued to call the water contaminated. But they agreed on working level communication by experts bilaterally. Now on Taiwan, given the large-scale military drills China conducted recently, Mr. Kishida told Mr. Lee peace and prosperity around the Taiwan Straits is important for Japan and the international community. And Mr. Lee told Mr. Kishida the Taiwan issue was Beijing's core interest and a red line. Now, Olivia, I'd like to hear from you. Can you read into Premier Lee's response to Mr. Kishida?
Well, Mitch, I think it was interesting that during the trilateral summit that went on, we saw some of these more specific hot-button issues that would have caused tensions between these two countries not actually being mentioned. One observer I spoke to said that this was perhaps an intentional choice so as to keep the trilateral talks cordial and pave the way for further cooperation as China would like to see. There was mention by China of respecting each other's mutual interest and major concerns. Premier Lee also at a business summit said that the three countries should reject external disruption, which is a likely veiled swipe at the U.S. But instead, as you mentioned there, we saw the more substantive issues, for example, Taiwan being discussed in the bilateral meeting ahead of this trilateral summit. But analysts say even though these issues were discussed between the two countries with Japan, the statements that were made were largely symbolic, and China repeating the same points as it has to, but not escalating tensions. Also, not to say that these are issues that they don't want it to be discussed, but perhaps not at this particular platform. As we do know, Japan had raised concerns about Beijing's military drills around Taiwan back then in 2022, when then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. We saw Beijing fire missiles across the island, Japan saying some of them had landed in its exclusive economic zone, which China has continued to deny, but likely this would be something that both sides would want to discuss, but perhaps behind closed doors so as to be able to pave the way at least at this summit for further cooperation.
Yeah, and just picking up from what Olivia said about how, China says that they should, reject these external interferences. Yoon-suk, so then I guess the question is, can this summit, truly really diffuse the tensions amidst China's rivalry with the U.S., key allies to Japan and South Korea? That's always been a sticking point, isn't it?
It is. And, the summit alone, definitely not. And I don't think anyone that I've spoken to was expecting that to happen. But they were saying that this trilateral summit could definitely bring South Korea and Japan a bit closer to China than in the past, now that they have met and they have discussed security and the economic issues. And so that is a beginning. But it's very interesting that this trilateral summit is being held before the trilateral meeting by the defense ministers from the U.S., South Korea, and Japan on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Forum in Singapore. And so many analysts here are saying that it is in a way good that South Korea was able to talk to the Chinese side and also to Japan about this. But, as the three leaders said today, they were saying that this is really just the first step that they're taking, which is significant to hopefully a much better bilateral ties, trilateral ties between the three sides. But Michio, going back to what you just said, I'm just curious about, President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida. They also talked about North Korea's plans to launch the spy satellite following reports that North Korea notified Japan of its plans. I'm just curious as to how Japan is reacting to this.
Well, Mr. Kishida immediately ordered his government to be prepared for any unforeseen circumstances after he received notification on North Korea's plan. Okinawa, the southern Japanese island, is especially worried as the satellite's flight route is over its island. It's flown in the past over Okinawa 3 times, and the Okinawa governor said that it's on the alert, and the Self-Defense Force is standing by with its PAC-3 missile defense system.
All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this discussion. Thanks so very much, CNA's Olivia Seong, as well as Michio Ishida in Japan and Lim Yoon-suk in Seoul.